Hello everyone! In this video I'm going to introduce how to structure a master's dissertation. Of course there can be variations, but this is a basic structure you could follow. So let's start. The first three sections of your dissertation are acknowledgement, abstract, and a table of contents. You don't have to have acknowledgement, but if you would like to thank your participants, peers, lecturers, supervisor, or anyone else, you could do that in this section. The next one is an abstract. You probably know that this is a brief summary of your dissertation. Here you need to mention the purpose of your study, how it was conducted, and introduce the key findings. These three sections are usually written at the end, after you have completed everything else. Then we have the chapters. The key chapters of your dissertation are introduction, literature review, methodology, findings and discussion, and conclusion. You could have findings and discussion in two separate chapters, one for findings and another one for discussion. But if you are conducting a qualitative study, I would advise you to have just one chapter combining both to avoid repetition. And of course, the chapters are followed by a list of references. You need to include all the sources you have cited in the dissertation, and you need to have appendices. Now I am going to discuss in detail what you need to include in each chapter. So the first chapter is introduction, in which you need to introduce the background and rationale of your study. In other words, why you decided to research this particular topic, problem, or issue. Of course, you need to also consider the context. By context, I mean not only the geographical location, but also some important contextual details. For example, if you are conducting a study in a high school in China, you probably need to discuss Chinese educational system focusing on high schools. In the introduction chapter, you also need to point out what the aim of your study is. And at the end of the introduction, you need to present an overview of the dissertation, what you are going to discuss in each chapter. For example, you could say something like, in the literature review, I'm going to discuss X, the methodology chapter will focus on Y, etc. Because the dissertation is a long document, this will make it more reader-friendly, so the reader will know what to expect in each chapter. The next chapter is the literature review. The aim of this chapter is to demonstrate that you are familiar with the topic area and point out the gap. You need to start this chapter with an introductory paragraph mentioning what you are going to discuss in the chapter. Actually, you need to start almost all chapters with an introductory paragraph. This helps the reader follow your argument. So, in this chapter, you need to discuss what has already been said and done in the area. You could discuss relevant concepts, theories, and studies. For example, if you are researching motivation to learn English, you need to briefly discuss key motivation theory used in the area and point out their limitations. And then you need to discuss in detail the theory you are going to employ in your study, indicating why you decided to use this particular theory. Of course, you need to also consider some relevant studies. As I have mentioned, in the literature review, you need to also point out the gap, what hasn't been done, and you need to finish this chapter with a concluding paragraph indicating what you have discussed in the chapter. Importantly, the literature review needs to be relevant and focused. Please do not include general or irrelevant information in the literature review. It also must be up to date. Of course, you could and sometimes need to refer to studies conducted a while ago, but you need to also cite more recent sources to demonstrate that you are aware of the developments in the area. Finally, your literature review needs to be critical. Describing what others have said is not sufficient. You also need to analyze and evaluate the sources and build your own argument. You could end the literature review with the research questions. Because in this section, at the end of the literature review, you need to point out the gap. So after that, you could introduce your research questions. Or you could include the research questions in the methodology chapter. So it's up to you in which chapter to include them. But your research questions must be explicitly stated. The next chapter is the methodology, which aims to explain how the study was conducted. Again, you need to have an introductory paragraph. If you decide to include your research questions in this chapter, so you could state them here. First of all, you need to also mention what approach you adopted for your study. Qualitative, quantitative, or mixed method, and explain why you decided to use this particular approach. Of course, you need to refer to the relevant literature to support your ideas. Then you need to have a section on participants. In this section, you need to introduce the sampling context, for example, a primary school in a particular region in the country. You need to also talk about sampling method, and of course you need to introduce the participants. Whatever you decide to mention about the participants will depend on your research aims and also approach. But you need to remember, when introducing the participants, you need to protect their identity. This is important. So you need to think about confidentiality and anonymity. You need to also have a section on data collection tools. Whatever you have used, questionnaire, interviews, reflective portfolio, or task. If you use the questionnaire, you need to explain how it was designed, or maybe you just adapted an existing questionnaire. You need to explain all this. If you used an interview, you need to explain what kind of interview and why. Again, you need to refer to the literature to support your methodological decisions. Please don't forget to include questionnaire or interview question or whatever you used as a data collection tool in the appendix. Also, you need to discuss your data collection procedure. You need to explain how you collected the data, your steps. For example, you could say something. First of all, I designed the interviews, interview questions, then piloted the questions, conducted first round of interviews, analyzed the data, etc. So you need to introduce your steps of data collection. If the data were collected electronically, for example, maybe you used Skype or WeChat or any other tool, you need to explain why and acknowledge the limitations. Also, of course, you need to explain how the data were analyzed. By the way, you could combine these two. You could have just one section called data collection procedure and analysis, and you could discuss this in one section. Of course, your data analysis depends on the approach you adopted. For quantitative Data, probably you used SPSS, maybe you did t-test, correlation, or ANOVA, or something else. For qualitative data, researchers frequently use thematic analysis. Here are two examples of how you could present themes and codes if you used thematic analysis. So in both samples here, the researchers used thematic analysis, but presented the codes and themes in different ways. There are other possibilities as well. For example, you could present your codes and themes in a table. So it's up to you to decide how to do this. In the methodology chapter, you need to also consider validity and reliability. You need to explain how you ensure the quality of your study. This again depends on whether you adopted qualitative or quantitative approach. Finally, you need to discuss the ethical consideration. You need to explain what measures were taken to protect the participants' rights. And similar to other chapters, you need to have a concluding paragraph here. The next chapter is findings and discussion. I have already mentioned you can have this into separate chapters, or you could discuss findings and have their discussion in one chapter. This is a very important chapter because here in this chapter you are answering your research questions. So similar to other chapters, you should have an introductory paragraph. Then you need to present the key findings and discuss them. You could structure this chapter by themes, your key findings, or by research questions. Whichever way you choose to do this, please remember that you need to answer your research questions. Actually, you could even at the beginning of this chapter remind the reader what your research questions are. If your study is qualitative, you need to also use extracts from the data to support your claims. But please remember that whatever approach you use, you need to refer to the literature when discussing your findings. This is very important. And of course, you need to have a concluding paragraph. Here is an example of building an argument using interview data. In the first sentence here, the researcher presents the findings. The classroom layer of context is predominantly a source of motivation for the participants to integrate GCE and ELT. This is the key finding. Then he explains this and refers to the literature to support his argument. And you can also see that the researcher also provides an extract from the interview as an evidence. This is a good example how you could do this and how to integrate both literature and interview data to support your ideas. The final chapter is a conclusion. Here you need to summarize your study, state its limitations, and also spell out your contribution. It is important to end your study on a positive note. So you could also discuss the implications and suggest potential areas for further research. I would like also to point out what else is important to consider when writing a dissertation. So you need to know that the word count excludes acknowledgements, contents page, any footnotes, any glossary of acronyms, the list of references, and appendices. So these are not included in the word count. And finally, I would like to also mention what some important points related to the presentation of your work. This is academic work, so you need to be aware of this as well. So please use double spacing and 12 times New Roman or 1112 Arial calibri fonts. Please avoid one-sentence paragraphs and don't start a sentence with and or but. Instead of starting your sentence with and, you can use, for example, in addition or furthermore. Instead of but, you could start your sentence with however or nevertheless. And there are other possibilities as well, of course. Do not start a sentence with a number. If you do, you need to spell it out. Please don't use contractions, don't, isn't, won't. Instead, you need to use the full version. Do not, is not, will not. You need to also know that you need to reference correctly. If you aren't sure how to do that, please check Skillset Library website. You need to also use signposting to help the reader follow your argument. Your work should be reader-friendly. And finally, you need to proofread your work before submitting it. I think that's it. In this video, I have introduced how to structure a master's dissertation and what you need to consider in each section. Of course, this information is general. If you have some specific questions, I would advise you to contact your supervisor and clarify them. Good luck with your dissertation.